Welcome back to Wildcats Podcast with Wildcats Conservation Alliance. I'm Amy Van Gelder, and if you've ever wanted to hear more about tigers and Amur leopards from experts working to save these iconic species, then you're in the right place. Each episode, we touch upon a different subject concerning the threats these endangered species face and the conservation being done to keep them in Asia's remaining wild spaces. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the new IUCN Green Status Assessment of tigers. But to do that, we first need to look at the history of assessing species and why we do it. You may already be familiar with the IUCN Red List of threatened species, and that's basically a health check for different plants, fungi, and animals across the world and tells us how close they are to extinction. Scientists and conservationists look at things like how many individuals are left, where they live and what threats they face, and then place each species into a category from least concern all the way up to extinct. It's a vital tool in helping us understand which species are most at risk and where we need to focus our efforts and funds to protect them. The Red List was first established in 1964, and over the last 60 years, it's been used to assess more than 160,000 species and is very much a collaborative global effort involving thousands of experts. While the Red List is an incredibly important metric, it only tells one side of the story, and that's how close a species is to extinction. It measures decline and loss, but doesn't capture what is working, for example, where a species has started to recover thanks to conservation efforts. So, to bridge this gap, the IUCN launched the Green Status of Species in 2021, and in 2025, the first ever Green Status Assessment for the tiger was published. In today's episode, we're lucky enough to be joined by the lead author of the assessment, Dr. Luke Hunter. Widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts on the conservation of endangered wild carnivores and their habitats, it makes sense Luke was involved in the new Green Status of Tiger assessment. With a career spanning more than 3 decades, Luke has worked across Africa, Asia and beyond. He is one of the founders of the NGO Panthera and is now director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Big Cat programme. Luke has also written extensively on carnivore biology and conservation, publishing 8 books and authoring over 200 articles in scientific journals and popular media. So Luke, thank you so much for joining me and congratulations on the publication of the Tiger's Green Status Assessment. So, why is it important to have this second metric alongside the Red List? And what can it tell us that the Red List isn't already telling us? And how do they kind of complement each other?
The value of the green status, the red list is sort of that, that global standard for how likely a species is to go extinct, and it's become a very, very powerful way to assess, any taxa or any species with that at that extinction risk level. And so really how endangered it is and how imminent or how likely the extinction is. The green status kind of flips that idea to say how recovered is the species. And so, it helps to give a more balanced view of the sort of the conservation status. It captures things that the Red List doesn't. So for example, not only how recovered the species is, but how, functional it is. Is the species performing its ecological functions in all or some areas of its range? And those kinds of comparisons give you an idea of the extent of recovery. And so it's, I think it sort of fleshes out the conservation picture, and at the same time, it sort of, it establishes a kind of a roadmap for the recovery potential. So what the Red List doesn't do, the Red List is sort of raising the alarm on, we need to act, we need to try and reverse the trends, and there's been some huge successes there. The Green Status says what could be possible in terms of how the species could be recovered. And so I think that balance is really important. I'll give you one example from the cat world, which I think is really powerful. The Iberian lynx, this formerly critically endangered, most endangered species of cat on Earth, and it was critically endangered from, I forget the exact time, but about, in the early 2000s, there were fewer than 100 Iberian lynx left on Earth. It was it was listed as critically endangered around that period. It was critically endangered for some years, but a massive conservation effort and investment was made. And there's now 2,000 Iberian lynx in Portugal and Spain. And the red list status has changed from critically endangered now to vulnerable. So it's gone through two down listings, which of course are actually upgrades, they're good news. So from critically endangered through endangered now to vulnerable, that's really, really positive. The green status assessment shows that the species is still largely depleted though. So it shows that even with those gains, we can't relax. It's not much different designation on the green status than the tiger, interestingly enough. So I think it balances out there to make sure that we can celebrate the victories with the red list documents when there are victories. But the green status really does a good job of saying, okay, there's still a lot of work to be done and still a lot of potential, if we do that work well.
So you mentioned the Iberian lynx's status on the green list, and that shows it's still largely depleted, which is a little better than the tigers, which is critically depleted. But can you explain a bit more about what critically depleted actually means within the green status context?
Surely, yeah. So the green status, what you end up with, quite a lot of detail, but what you end up with at the sort of the headline is a recovery score. And that really indicates how far from, quote, full recovery the species is. And so in the case of the tiger, that score is 14%, of the potential full recovery. And we can talk about what full recovery actually means, because that's also can be a bit confusing. It doesn't mean tigers everywhere they used to be at the same densities or, abundance, but it does mean sort of they're widely distributed and better off than they are now. So the tiger's recovery score is 14, which anything more than 0 and under 20 fits in the critically depleted category. And I mentioned the Iberian lynx earlier, that's at 22%. So that's in the next category, which is largely depleted. Sounds better, is a better category, but again, that point I was making, not that much difference to the tiger, even though its conservation trajectory and its red list status is much more improved. So the tiger currently at sort of 14% score, green status score, 14% of the potential of full recovery is critically depleted. We can see that. And again, that's an important balance, I think, to have, because we're right at the point now, very, very positively, very excitingly, the tigers have just started to recover. We're seeing recovery of tiger populations in a number of areas fairly recently, only in the last decade, a little bit longer in countries like India. But so there's a positive but very embryonic trend in terms of recovery of the tiger. That's fantastic. But again, the green status reminds us that it's still very, very early days, that we are a long way from what could be accomplished in terms of the recovery potential.
So you touched upon the regionality of the recovery of tigers a little there when you mentioned India, but we've also seen that they are now regionally extinct across much of their historic range. Despite this, the green status analysis awarded tigers with a high conservation legacy. So firstly, how is conservation legacy measured? Over what time frame? Does it go back to Year of the Tiger in 2010 or goes back even further? And then also, how can a species have both a high risk of extinction and a high conservation legacy? Some might argue it means that the conservation wasn't effective.
Yeah, so the conservation legacy compares what we think would have happened if conservation effort wasn't invested, wasn't made, and it's really clear. And it's in some cases it's based on data where we have that. In some cases, of course, it's based on a somewhat subjective assessment. But if there wasn't conservation investment and effort, the situation of the tiger would be much worse now. And so the conservation legacy tries to assess the current situation today of the status compared with what would have been the case if that conservation effort wouldn't have been made. And we have some really good indicators showing that, again, it seems intuitive, we hope it is, but we need to measure it. Is conservation working? Is it actually worth it? What does conservation legacy mean? And one of the analyses we did, a separate paper, a separate analysis, but shows that in forests where there are tigers, they are degrading 4 times as slowly as exactly the same kinds of forests where there aren't tigers. And that's really interesting, because I think what we're seeing with a data point like that is that the investment, which has been focused on tigers in a lot of cases because they're a high value species, they've attracted investment that's been successful in those areas, but it also protects a much wider ecosystem. And so we have all these sorts of interesting both pieces of data and also more anecdotal evidence that shows that conservation legacy is high for the species.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that measure. And there were a couple of other metrics as well that were recorded for the assessment, and that was conservation dependence and conservation gain, which both came out as low. And this could be considered surprising, as you would assume tigers were reliant on conservation because of the huge number of threats that they have to face. So, can you explain a bit more about the low scores for these?
Yeah, Amy, you're absolutely right. That's a really good point. It can be confusing because, of course, tigers are very reliant upon conservation. And I think, the assessors, the tiger conservation community has no doubt that, if tiger range state governments, if NGOs, if conservation practitioners weren't doing what they were doing, the prospects would be much poorer. And again, there's a lot of evidence for that. The conservation reliance and gain is the reason they are confusing is they're only measured over 10 years. And again, the 10-year standard, I didn't make that up, and I think it's fine, but it's to apply to a very wide range of taxa, of course. And so there are some compromises made there. And I would say that doesn't work very well for a fairly long-lived species like tigers, which takes a long time for conservation gains to be realized. So, it was important to state the narrative of the green status of the assessment of the tiger makes that point, because you're absolutely right. At first, you'll say, well, wait, that doesn't make sense. I've always thought the tiger is really reliant upon conservation. What does this mean? Again, that 10-year time frame, because it doesn't capture many generations of tiger or the results of that investment, doesn't really reflect that. And so this is why, for example, the recovery potential, the sort of more aspirational view, is measured over 100 years. We project a much longer time frame to really try to capture what is possible in terms of recovery.
So you just mentioned the recovery potential, and we spoke briefly earlier on the regionality of this. So could you share a bit more about where tigers have made the most progress and where we're still seeing populations struggling, and why do you think there are those regional disparities?
Yeah, the most progress, of course, India, has done an amazing job, ever since Project Tiger was launched. And in terms of individual countries, the recovery of tigers there stands out. There is nowhere like India. And tigers continue to recover, populations continue to grow in India, which is really extraordinary. But we're also seeing that in nearby countries like Bhutan and Nepal, similar sorts of recoveries going on there. Of course, not nearly the numbers. India has a lot of room for tigers, a lot of space, and the population, of course, is the largest in India of any country. But then the other, more recently, and I think really, really optimistic, or at least reassuring, is signs of recovery in Southeast Asia. And that's where, most recently the conservation outlooks for tigers have been really, really poor. They've been lost from Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. That's this century. That's the last couple of decades. They became extinct in those countries. They're lost, of course, from the islands of Java and Bali earlier on. But we're now seeing populations recovering in Thailand, in Indonesia, or at least stable in parts of Indonesia, stable and very gentle recoveries, and similar situation in Malaysia. Not as dramatic, or not quite as optimistic as the recovery in parts of Thailand, but in Malaysia as well, a similar sort of scenario now, where in places like Endau Rompin in the southern Malaysian peninsula, tigers are slowly recovering. So I think that's more recent. And again, because Southeast Asia has been very recently, historically, so difficult for tigers, mainly because of human population density, incredible human population densities that, of course, have real impacts on tigers. And we're seeing very early days, but a reversal of those trends where tigers are now recovering in the region.
So the assessment suggested that with sustained and intensified conservation, tigers could rebound substantially. It even went as far as to say, if all plausible conservation actions were implemented at maximum effectiveness, tigers could return to all regions within 100 years. So there are two main ways that tigers could potentially come back, and that is through natural recolonisation and then also reintroductions. And so, As a thought experiment, if we were to ignore all financial constraints, what do you think is needed to see this sort of recovery?
I love the idea of ignoring financial constraints. Let's do
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah, that 100-year projection is it's intended to be aspirational. It's intended to say if not unrealistic, and that's why the recovery score of the tiger is medium and not high or very high, because actually, even what that means, the most likely, I mean, the most positive outcome, does not mean that tigers can be everywhere they occurred 100 years ago. That representativeness that you said, like they could be in all regions, what happens with the green status is you divide the historic range, it's called indigenous range in the process, everywhere that the tiger formerly occurred within historic times, up into discrete spatial units. And those spatial units, in the case of the tiger, there are 24 spatial units. And they were, and so you try to capture all the unique ecological settings in which the species exists or exists. So you have Amur tigers in northeast China and Russia are very distinct from Bengal tigers in South Asia. But then even within, those subspecific differences, you wanted to capture really important ecological differences. So for example, we separated out the Sundarban mangroves from, Himalayan forest and dry and moist, South Asian forest, and they become separate spatial units. So when we say that it's possible, the tiger could occupy, could be restored to all parts of its range. We mean could be represented in every one of those 24 spatial units. And so they're extinct now in 9 of them. In the best possible case, they could be represented in all of them again. But again, some of that would be, very, very difficult and also very modest. So for example, they're probably never going to be back in Bali. But in the assessment process, we join Java and Bali as Java and Bali forest. They're a particular type of, distinct type of ecological habitat. And so it might be possible in Java. There's some few thousand square kilometers of forested habitat remaining. There's maybe a few hundred Javan leopard, still left. And so it's not impossible to imagine that with all the right conservation investment and actions, they could be restored. We assess that there could never be more. And again, never say never, but in that most optimistic scenario, extremely unlikely that tigers would ever number more than 50 in the best case scenario. So they would be represented, but they would be technically in Java, they would still be critically endangered. In terms of you asked about the conservation actions. I think it's a kind of thing we've been doing now and seeing success for the last 30 years or more. It's doing a good job of protecting tigers and their prey from poaching in protected forest in areas that they need. It's working very closely with communities to give them reasons not to kill tigers, and that of course can take a number of forms. Some of it is directly related to livelihoods, where tigers create problems for people because they kill livestock. They're occasionally dangerous to people, but there's a lot of, really active and very successful fairly basic techniques that are mostly about how you live with tigers, which can resolve those issues. They can reduce them to maybe not zero, but very, very close. So it becomes, me living in the US with grizzly bears and mountain lions. There's a risk, but it's extremely small, and you can mitigate the main risk, which is really to livelihoods, to the livestock issue. And it's sort of the intersection of those things, I think, is if people are hunting tigers and their prey for profit, which is usually the case for tigers. It's a high value species. And so again, that comes back to protection, or for prey, which can be both, a complicated mix of profit and sustenance. And so making sure that we have solutions to those problems. And again, I think there are many, many great examples from across tiger range where we've figured out that those things can work. And so again, it would be an application of those techniques. No doubt fueled by emerging technology, which would be great, because I think that just helps accelerate what we know. So it's really an escalation of those successful techniques. And in that scenario, that's where we say, you could have tigers in every spatial unit where they once occurred. And that would represent full recovery, but again, that doesn't mean the same number as tigers occurring absolutely everywhere as they did 100 years ago.
Yeah, and I think if tigers were to naturally recolonize their historic range, they would have to have connected habitats to allow them to spread between protected areas and then disperse. But given the extent of human infrastructure development over the years, when looking at the maps, do you think it's even possible for all tigers to be connected by safe forested passages in the future?
It's challenging, no doubt. I think it's possible, but also in some cases, we we sort of did this sort of separate but related exercise that sort of compared where tigers currently exist and where they don't exist in but the habitat's suitable. And it's quite extraordinary because the amount of forested habitat on Earth of those two categories it's about the same. So tigers currently occur in 900,000, 900 and some thousand square kilometers. We know they occur. A lot of those are protected areas, the big national parks, the places that are, still conserving tigers, and with some of them where tigers are recovering. And about the same amount of forest, 900,000 something and change, is suitable forest, but tigers don't occur there. And a lot of it is adjacent forest. It's part of large connected mosaics. And so, in that case, again, the application of those conservation interventions I mentioned earlier need to just expand into those surrounding forest areas to provide that safe haven. So as tigers recover in the core protected areas, they start dispersing out into appropriate habitat. And with that scenario, you don't have to create new habitat. You have to protect it better in most cases. And we're not even talking about necessarily setting up, new protected areas, but certainly a level of protection and retaining forest that would mean that tigers have safe haven when they move in there. But that's just with existing forests. Now, to your question of corridors, yes, some populations are isolated. And they remain more challenging to connect. And so that's where I think you really, some of the planning now needs to happen in retaining habitat that could function as corridors now. And so in some of those, they are very tenuous, they're just strips of riverine habitat through oil palm, for example. All tigers use those. And making sure that the infrastructure issues that you mentioned are addressed too. And so things like, underpasses and overpasses, to make sure that tigers are safe in crossing highways and railways and so on. And there's some really good examples of that. The Thai government, India's certainly done this a lot, but the Thai government put in an amazing overpass in eastern Thailand in what's sometimes called the Eastern Forest Complex, but where there are the tigers in the eastern part of that area in Taplan and other protected areas on the eastern side of the complex, but they're not on the western side of the complex in Khao Yai where they used to be. It's contiguous forest, but there's a big highway through it. And the Thai government has committed the resources and put in an amazing overpass, so traffic goes over and there's free passage. And so we haven't documented tigers on the western side yet, but it's inevitable. I'm sure they'll eventually start crossing as the population on the east recovers and builds a critical mass, and they can move into that western side. So I think with all of those, recolonisation of existing forest, maintaining corridors, and then sometimes reforesting and fostering corridors, that would all contribute to the recovery potential that we're talking about.
Yeah, excellent. And as you said, even just building infrastructure like roads or rail overpasses or underpasses, which isn't a forested corridor, but does allow tiger movement, is really going to help them naturally disperse. Another way tigers could return to their former range, which I briefly mentioned earlier, is through reintroductions. Your doctoral and postdoctoral research in Southern Africa pioneered reintroductions of large cats into former ranges. How applicable are those lessons to the idea of reintroducing tigers to part of their former range in Asia?
Good question. Yeah, African experience, I think it's directly applicable. I think the restoration of large carnivores, when you go to do these reintroduction projects, they rely on a few basics, and that's what I was sort of interested when it wasn't well understood, now 30 or so years ago when I did my PhD on restoring lions and cheetahs, mostly also leopards. But some of the fundamental principles, they were wild caught animals, not from captivity. They knew how to be wild cats. Obviously the area needed to be well protected. We needed to address the reasons, the fundamental reasons why cats disappeared from those areas to begin with. And then a really important aspect of it, I think, and this was a learning experience, we drew from, the experience of the restoration of wolves here in North America, but the soft release versus hard release debate, which is, you catch cats, I mean, anything carnivores, and release them. And a lot of that had happened in a conflict scenario. It still happens. It happens with tigers, it happens with leopards and lions. But cats are caught in a conflict scenario where they're creating issues for a local community. And usually the government agency intervenes, catches them rather than kills them, which sounds good, but then just sort of dumps them back in a protected area, and it doesn't work. They move, or they create issues in that population. And so we tested the idea, and of course, it doesn't really seem like rocket science, but it turns out to be really, really important. Is you don't do that. You do what's called a soft release, where they're retained at the site for a while. They're kept in big enclosures. They're given time to adapt to the new situation. And when you do that, they're much less likely to just sort of bombshell, to disappear, and often to try and head for home. The big cats, it turns out, like lots of species, have really good homing instincts, and we have some really bad examples of where that's happened. And leopards have returned 800 kilometers from where they were caught, because that soft release technique hadn't been used. So I think all those fundamentals directly apply. And in the case of the tiger, I think we're still learning. I mean, something we didn't do in Africa was, take orphan cubs from the wild, and attempt to rehabilitate those. And I would have thought that's a bad idea, because, cubs learn so much from their mothers in terms of how to be a tiger or how to be a cheetah or a lion. But really interestingly, Dan McCall at WCS are collaborating with Russian colleagues, with the Russian Academy of Sciences and Sokotia Lynn Reserve in Russia. Did this for many years with Siberian tigers, with Amur tigers, where orphan cubs, there's often high rates of orphaning of cubs during winter. Females are poached or otherwise killed. Cubs end up sort of in dire straits and they're captured. And then the approach this program took was to then sequester those cubs from human contact. So they were kept in big enclosures where they didn't have direct human contact. And gradually over time, they were exposed to released prey. So, wild pigs and small prey and so on, and, to test their skills and gradually get them used to being a tiger. And then at about the age that they would naturally disperse, they were released into an area of Russia close to the China border where tigers were extinct, where Amur tigers had been wiped out. And it was surprisingly successful. Most of them prospered. I think there was one problem animal who crossed the border into China. He created issues with livestock. He was eventually recaught. And actually, he was the individual which sort of, in the early days, was most exposed to human contact. So maybe that was a factor. But it was surprising, the cubs, the profile of what the cubs hunted, now they're, young tigers, but was very similar in comparison to what we know from wild tigers, that had just grown up naturally. So basically the profile of wild boar, ungulates, small carnivores, and also livestock, a very small percentage, essentially the same. So they mostly, at least from their feeding ecology, hunting, predation behavior, they acted like wild tigers. And they went on to reproduce. There were some really fantastic examples of those originally orphaned females as adults finding males and reproducing and raising their cubs. So we're still learning. I think, there's still quite a lot of exciting techniques to apply to restoring wild tigers in a handful of areas around the world.
Are there any realistic reintroduction sites for tigers within Asia at the moment that excite you, or do you think natural recolonisation is a better route?
I think both apply. I think natural recolonisation has the much larger potential in terms of, the area of habitat and the potential number of tigers. And again, the 900,000 and some square kilometers of available habitat for tigers, most of that, in the best case scenario, could be naturally recolonized. Again, with that, making sure that it was, there were corridors, or that it was adjacent to source tiger populations. If we do all the right things, a lot of that could be naturally colonized. And I think that in the end, that has greater conservation impact. But in terms of actual reintroduction, I think there's actually, there's probably two, I think, really exciting projects sort of at early stages. One is in Kazakhstan and Southeast Kazakhstan, former range of the Caspian tiger, which of course is extinct now, but genetically virtually exactly the same as the Amur tiger, probably actually the same subspecies if we were to go back and look at that. And so there's a quite advanced project in southeast Kazakhstan, close to the border with Kyrgyzstan and China, in quite an extensive area of remaining habitat. I mean, there's some tens of thousands, I think it's 50 or maybe even more thousand square kilometers of habitat, quite modified. There's agriculture and there's human communities in those, but within those areas, there's smaller areas of some 5,000 square kilometers, which are really intact habitat. One of those has been set aside as a dedicated reserve. And now the government of Kazakhstan, cooperating mainly with, I think, WWF, has really advanced a program to reintroduce tigers in there, using Amur tigers as a source, again, genetically very, very similar. And so they've restored a lot of habitat. They've moved out livestock where it's possible to do that with local communities. They have reintroduced Bukhara deer, which is the red deer, the Central Asian form of red deer there, and fostering the protection of other prey like wild pigs. And now have the first two Amur tigers, captive sourced Amur tigers, interestingly, from European zoos, which won't be released, but which their progeny or maybe their progenies will be released. Similar to the way the orphan cub program was prosecuted. So again, they're sequestered, they're sort of, quote, taught how to be wild tigers, and then it's those that are released, not the captive cats. So I think that's really exciting. That's been a well-designed and implemented project, and I think has real scope for that population recovering. And then the only other one that I know of, which I think has real merit, real potential, is actually in Thailand, in sort of central northern Thailand, northeast of Bangkok, in an area. There's a complex of protected areas called Pukiao, Nam Nao, and tigers no longer occur there. But there is forest, good forest. There's some prey and a process now to try and recover prey. And this is very, very early days, but there's some potential there. I mean, real potential, I think, and especially with the recovery of tigers elsewhere in Thailand, which would create a reasonable source that you could actually capture tigers selectively, very strategically, without impacting the recovery of the source population, and use those as founders for a new area, for this new area in Pukiao. I think that also is really quite exciting, and further away, perhaps in the Kazakhstan project, but also maybe a very real possibility to reintroduce tigers.
Yeah, that does sound really exciting, but obviously a growing population, whether it be through reintroductions or more natural dispersing, comes with its challenges, specifically for reintroductions. There are a lot of human ethics to consider. So how do conservationists balance that up, who are working on those types of projects?
It's a critical part, Amy. Yeah, and it would be unethical to just bring tigers, only large carnivore, into a system where you haven't undergone. I mean, it requires a really thoughtful, protracted, consultative process with local communities to firstly design ways that they will benefit from this. If you're bringing back tigers, will they actually end up benefiting? And that can be challenging. If tourism or other benefits are linked to it, then okay, maybe that's an easy solution, but it's not always easy. And then, of course, addressing what you said, which is the potential for conflict. And so if local people are reliant upon livestock, primarily upon livestock, you have to get ahead of that. You have to introduce the measures which will mitigate that problem in advance. You have to put in whatever those processes are in terms of equipping people to live well with tigers. But again, there are some great examples. A project model that occurs to me is something that we at WCS have done with local communities in Loisa in Indonesia, in Aceh, and that's equip people with the sort of the knowledge and the ability to deal with tigers when they come near villages. And so the first part of that is, if you own livestock, manage the livestock well. And that's usually boils down to bringing it in at nighttime in a strong corral, build a good corral, and make sure that livestock is in there so it's not vulnerable to predation. There's not free roaming livestock that attracts tigers in the first place. And so, we've helped design and train and fund that process, but people take it on. It's a very easy thing to take on if there's some resources and expertise there that and it's self-evident that it works. But the second thing that really works is then developing community-based teams that know how to respond when a tiger is seen or thought to be in the area. And so these teams of folks, again, all community members. Originally, they were with WCS sort of expertise and supervision assistance, if you like, and that's no longer required. But if a tiger comes into a village, there's an alert system that tells people, there's one around or there's one coming, be careful. Don't go out at night, don't go to the bathroom at night, don't be careful, bring your livestock in. But then they also go out to look for the tiger, and then they just haze it back into the forest. They bang pots and they yell at it and they throw firecrackers in there. But they have agency in the process now. They know that they're able to do that with, the way they've been trained, with the equipment they have, with the communication now that they're coordinating. And so again, I think there's a lot of ways to get ahead of the conflict problem, and you couldn't do a reintroduction project without doing that. It would ultimately just fail, I think, if you didn't have the community invested and on board.
Yeah, I completely agree. Affected communities are integral to the success of growing tiger numbers. And on the topic of growth, the assessment stated if tigers were restored to all suitable historic habitat, either by natural recolonisation or reintroductions, there could be over 25,000 tigers living in the wild, which is over 5 times the current global population. Do you think it's possible for the modern world to live alongside this many tigers, especially if we're already seeing conflict with the numbers we currently have?
I mean, I don't think it's impossible. Again, it is an aspirational number, but that 25,000 comes from, again, that when I said there's available habitat, if that available habitat was repopulated. And, an existing habitat where tigers, we know tigers occur, they're often still significantly depleted. There are relatively few areas now where tigers are actually at their natural carrying capacity, at the numbers they could achieve if all human impacts were reduced. There's a number of places in India. There's now this area in Western Thailand that I've been referring to, where tigers in part of it have reached that carrying capacity. But so again, if tigers were able to reach carrying capacity in all the available habitat, again, most of it would be by natural recolonisation. Some of it would be by these reintroduction projects we've mentioned. Then you get to 25,000. And so I don't think that's impossible. I think that that's quite possible. Again, it would rely on, I think, this optimistic outlook of the socio-economic and demographic changes that the world is going through, that much of Asia has already experienced, that it shifts to an urban, highly expertise-driven economy, that it's no longer clearing forests to build that economy, that people are less reliant upon farming and other vocations that might put them in conflict with natural areas and with species like tigers. So it does rely on all of those things. But I think, to the point of conflict, again, we've got ways to manage that. And also it often, it astonishes me actually how little conflict we have with a species like tigers. And India is a really, really good example of this, where tigers live. They're very reliant upon high quality forest. But there's a significant proportion, I forget what it is, maybe 25% of India's tigers occur outside protected areas, in forest, but they're multi-use forest. They're where people at least can generally not live, but they're able to use the forest, non-timber forest products and so on. There's often livestock in there, sometimes not legally, but there can be livestock. And so there's obviously the potential for conflict there. And it's not trivial. Livestock is killed and people are killed in India. But again, it astonishes me that there is so little conflict. I think when it's well managed, when communities are well equipped to coexist with tigers, I'm not naive enough to say that there will never be any conflict, but it can be reduced to an extraordinarily low point. And again, I think there are models for that. India does this extraordinarily well. And so I think, there's about maybe 25,000 lions left on Earth. That might be slightly high, but we can cope with them. Again, with a whole series of challenges, but so I think, yeah, I like to think that there could be 25,000 tigers on Earth in the next number of decades, maybe in my lifetime.
That's really promising. And far more optimistic than a 2011 Mongabay article, which you open with the line, "We are losing the tiger." More than a decade later, after this new Green Status Assessment, would you still say that, or has the story changed?
You did great research, Amy. Yeah, that seems a long time ago now. It's so, it's not all rosy, of course. We are still losing the tiger in some areas. There's still the same issues. There's still poaching of tigers because they're a high value species. There's still some clearing of habitat. There's still a more widespread issue of poaching of prey, even when there's habitat and even if tigers are not the target. So those threats all exist to differing degrees in almost everywhere that the tiger occurs. But we have slowed the decline. So we've stemmed the decline in a lot of places. Again, when I say we, I mean all the conservation NGOs cooperating with range state governments and philanthropists and that whole community of tiger conservationists that have, I think, really sort of rallied around the idea that we cannot let that trend, that terrible trend, which, was really at its worst in the early 2000s, we can't let that continue. And as I said earlier, we have some examples of that now working. And in countries where, when I'd written that, particularly Southeast Asia, I was thinking we would mostly lose those populations. It seemed hard to imagine that they would cling on. And again, around that time, we were seeing the very last tigers disappear from countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. There was still, maybe by 2011, I mean, not much hope, but maybe a hope that, there was still a handful of animals in Laos, but they were, of course, they ended up being extinct around that time or prior to then. So it was a pretty bleak time. And now, it hasn't completely reversed, of course, but we've got these really outstanding models of success. We have really, really good evidence that shows that the interventions that have been put in place, again, by governments cooperating with NGOs and all other actors, they can work. They take a long time. They take decades. Tigers don't recover quickly, and these forests don't recover quickly. It takes real focus, again, on those main issues of poaching tigers and their prey, of the impacts on human communities, particularly conflict-related ones, and how you address those. But it can work, and it can end up in these recovery stories that we're now seeing in multiple range countries. So I think we're not there yet, of course. We have a long way to go, but I think the prospects for tigers are much more positive than they were a couple of decades ago.
And what a great way to end this podcast on such a positive note. Thank you so much for your time, Luke.
Thanks, great questions.
And that brings this episode to a close. Thank you all for listening, and look out for our next episode where I'll be joined by some more special guests. Please do subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and leave a review of the show. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.